So Fred had asked me to give a brief primer, 20, 30 minutes on measuring expertise, particularly in athletes, athletic populations. And so this has been a great conversation. I'm thrilled to be talking to all of you and so many different ideas. I am not an expert in expertise. I am learning, so I'm interested in the reinforcement. This is a great opportunity. But I have been doing work, in the lightning round. I told you guys to do a lot of work with vision and visual cognition, and that's the kind of link that brings me into this sphere of expertise. So I'm not going to talk really at all about research or data that comes from my lab, but more practical type issues. So there'll be a little theoretical stuff at the beginning, and then kind of a lot of practical issues that you run into in doing science with experts. And so this really comes from the framework of two things, measuring and improving. So the full title is Measuring and Improving Sensorimotor Function in Athletes. So unpacking that, you kind of want to know where you are, your strengths and your weaknesses, and how to improve upon those weaknesses, maybe to improve upon those strengths as well. And the idea here is then specifically targeting sensorimotor function and doing that in athletes. And, oh, there we are. So I think the idea of this expertise in sports gives us a little bit more constraint relative to the broad scope we were talking about earlier. And it should be apparent, or I'll tell you, that vision is extraordinarily important in athletics. Very few blind baseball players, football players. But there's very open debates about how important it is. And we'll cover some of that in just a few slides. But sports are dynamic, sports are fast, sports are variable. The dominant input is vision. So, and I can tell you guys, a lot of the brain is devoted to vision and whatnot. But the idea is that vision is the signal that directs the muscles of the body to respond. So the eyes lead the body, famous quotes from coaches. And I think about this interface as what I call sensorimotor abilities, the interface between transducing light, focusing the eyes on the relevant information, and making sense of it in order to accomplish a motor goal. Somewhat different because the motor goals are usually under really high demands. You play chess, you have motor goals, but moving a chess piece isn't the same thing as hitting a 95-mile-an-hour fastball. And, oops, let me use this. The two spheres beyond athletics, which this is obviously very important in, that have kind of emerged recently, or re-emerged recently, are these ideas of sports vision training really from an optometric standpoint, okay? Correcting and using vision training tools to improve vision for sports applied purposes, and then concussion management, because there are links between vision and concussion, both prospective and retrospective. So keep that in mind, because this is then important in that feedback circle of assessing, analyzing, and improving, both to get you better, but also to rehabilitate you if you've had an injury such as a concussion. I added this slide this morning in the midst of our other conversation. And one of the nice things about sports is that the outcome measures are very acute. Am I an expert? Check the box scores. Okay, that's a lot of how the world works, a sporting world. So if you look at this, you would say, hey, this guy here, LeBron James, he's an expert. This guy here, Jackson, he's not so much of an expert. So you have these very explicit outcome measures, which aren't always completely transparent. There's a whole area of sabermetrics, I should know that, and finding the really valuable predictive measures, outcome measures, that translate to what all of this is then packaged into, which is typically wins. Okay, so your contribution to your team winning. But sports have pretty well-defined statistics, which gives us a handle on expertise. Now, a bunch of scientists in a room can talk and make lots of good ideas and traction and stuff, but who you're oftentimes trying to convince are these people. The coaches, or in some military settings, you have your sergeants, you have your selection personnel, and they know what talent is when they see it. I can tell you that person is going to be awesome. I know it because I am an expert in expertise. So how can you scientists help me infer anything that I don't already know? So that's an important part. And you guys chime in, as we have all day. With questions.
Say otherwise?
Moneyball does possibly say otherwise. And so let me point to Herb here, because Herb is more knowledgeable than I am in a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about outside this particular sphere of science. But so you could feel free to chime in at time. But an interesting article came out about the teams that invest the most in analytics. And if you look at it, you have teams like the Phillies and the Astros and a list. They kind of took the big four sports and they broke them down, the big analytics group players and the people who don't rely on analytics at all. And there was no correlation between that and winning. The 76ers, they don't win at all. They invest a lot in analytics. So yes, Moneyball is certainly the idea that analytics even play into sports has gained a lot of traction since Moneyball and whatnot. But whether it's resulting in on-field success is still an open debate.
Sound like Charles Barkley.
Yeah, Moneyball came out Billy Beane and Flynn Athletics. Yeah. And their business model wasn't necessarily win championships, but find talent that they could keep trading away to maintain their winning record, not necessarily championships. And the Boston Red Sox took that analytics with commitment to actually funding talent where they actually won a championship in 80-some years.
So, and so they spend a lot on analytics, right? So you could probably find, I don't know, maybe the verdict's still out, but we're certainly interested in analytics because you can't do statistics on the eye test, right? So let me point out some ideas that I hope to cover here. So the geometry of the problem, I'm going to talk about it in terms of two triangles and a circle. The triangles, well, there's the information processing hierarchy, or information processing stream, which I think is maybe more of a bottleneck, so I should have a cylinder in here. But the sports vision pyramid, the reverse hierarchy of perceptual learning, and the idea of this feedback for assessing, analyzing, improving, that's kind of the geometry of the problem. And then the state of the science and the future directions is the idea that this is really in applied settings. This is more in the field than in the lab. So the geometry of the problem. In sports vision, kind of just borrowing a page from cognitive science in general, you get these kind of fitness models of how information processing would flow, where you have sensory receptors bringing in information from the outside world. It's transduced, it's sent up to the brain. There are perceptual mechanisms that have to select, that's attention, and detect and select. And then you have decision mechanisms, which have to make decisions upon the information that is available. And then you have effector mechanisms, which are controlling motor output. The muscles then do that. And this is all driven by intrinsic and extrinsic feedback, updating constantly when you're trying to accomplish your athletic goal. And all of this is modulated by operational memory, so past experiences, expertise, streamline some of these modules. And an important point, kind of in the notion of the training side of this, is that bottlenecks at any point in this stream could impair your end goal of that action. So you may have poor sensory reception, you may have poor attentional allocation, and even though at the end you can get it all done, particular bottlenecks along this pathway are the targets, could be the targets for the training, okay, to improve expertise, to improve performance. Well, I'll kind of circle back to this again in a minute, but is any of this really important for outcomes? So this idea and these mechanisms get broken down into hardware and software, which are probably pretty imperfect terms, which I tend to like a little bit better, the ideas of receptive and perceptive vision. So the idea of the mechanical and optometric properties of the eye, what Steve was talking about earlier, being able to select that 1% of the visual information that's probably moving very quickly, keeping your eyes coordinated on it, high fidelity vision. That is all kind of the receptive side of things, making sure that you are getting the right sensory input for processing and making decisions upon, and then planning that also. And then perceptive, which is upstream. You got your attention, you got your selection, you got your decision making, which is all going to be more plastic, more learned. So now the debate, so the idea here is, well, if these are really important for outcomes in sports, maybe we would be able to find differences between highly accomplished athletes and less accomplished athletes. So this is not a causal argument, but it certainly is some breadcrumbs. And the debate is, I would say, more leaning towards no than less historically, under the idea that experts can be characterized by differences in their receptive vision. Historically, a lot of the studies out there haven't found, beyond, you have your normal distribution, and if you cut off the low end of the range, when you make the analysis, there are no blind quarterbacks in the NFL, but once you have normal vision, that normal to above vision is about the same in the general population as it is in athletes. Now, there's argument in it. There are people certainly on the yes side of the camp and certainly people on the no side of the camp. And we'll talk about why there's two camps and the difficulties of resolving these issues. But the kind of contemporary view is that in order to find hardware differences, you actually have to have tasks that are really sensitive to the specific demands of the sport. You can't just treat all athletes the same because they don't do the same things. So this is still ongoing debate, but there's pretty much a consensus in some of the stuff that Anders talked about earlier about occlusion testing and knowing kind of memory of positions on the field and being able to make use of the kind of cognitive side of these faculties. Strong evidence points towards expert advantages. And this is kind of illustrated in these two review articles, which are they're meta-analyses. They've taken in big chunks of the literature, done effect size analyses, compared athletes and non-athletes, done moderator analyses for different sub-cohorts, interceptive sports, dynamic sports, static sports, male, female, team sport, all these potential moderators in there. And they've found, by and large, both domain-specific cognitive abilities, so these are mostly tasks linked in to measure the abilities that are really honed in these athlete populations. So fairly sport-specific cognitive abilities, anticipatory timing, positional type information processing, but also in general cognitive domains, useful field of view, non-sports specific, more of your kind of typical stuff you do with your undergrads at a university. So there's evidence on both of these and other places that software does differentiate athletes from non-athletes. I threw this slide in here. I think it's a very useful process model. Brad Hatfield was on the list of attendees. He's not here, but I've always found this to be a really useful model, so I wanted to put it in here. And you see this is kind of the proximal and the distal contributors to your performance, superior performance. And this is an idea we've come back to a bunch, which is this attentional focus and flexibility, being able to attend to the right cues at the right time. And all the way out here, you got genetic factors, cultural factors, all kinds of things play on performance. And the specific types of sports activities that this is geared toward are things that are really super dynamic. Hitting a baseball, shooting a target. So that's where they're coming from in this work. But gives you a sense of the factors that could be contributing and where you'd want to target for interventions, where you'd want to find differences for experts. So geometry, the vision pyramid. So this is when you're asking a question, in order to improve vision for improving athletics, what do we need to know? Well, we need to know what aspects of vision are important for a particular sport or activity. We need to know to what extent these attributes can be modified through training. If there's no plasticity, you're not going to get anywhere. And then we also want to know whether this training actually translates to improved performance. So that's the high bar, right? You train them and you can make their acuity better, but if that acuity isn't resulting in a higher batting average, you've just improved their acuity. So to have a real good scientific footing on these, the value of the interventions and whether they're doing anything, and whether these particular skills are really useful in expertise for sports, all three of those things are important. So this is kind of schematized in the pyramid with really low-level monocular. This comes from optometry, where they're really interested in alignment and correction. But the idea, and most of what I'm interested in is cognition, which they call mechanics. But you got your low-level processes, and you got your higher-level binocular processes build upon that, and then you got your mechanics, which is your attention, your working memory, and whatever, and then you got your on-field performance. So does improving something down here improve something up here? That would suggest that the bottleneck might have been down here, or a bottleneck. There can be multiple bottlenecks. So the next the next triangle, this is just to throw in kind of this idea I kind of mentioned a little in our open conversation, was about perceptual learning. So a lot of the ideas of improving vision for sports comes from the idea of improving perception for interpretation and for decision. And a really kind of explanatory neural model that I've always liked is the reverse hierarchy theory. And it basically is framed as such, that learning is a top-down driven process that goes as low as it needs to in the hierarchy, with the hierarchy being your kind of cortical processing hierarchy where you have very selective receptive fields at the input layers. They combine together into more complex, into even more complex, into objects. So the idea is that attention goes as low as it needs to in the hierarchy to drive learning, and that once that learning has happened, that the generalization, and I think I have that schematized here, learning generalizes downward. So what Steve was talking about earlier, if you're just training some point in the receptive field, that spatial information is not important for other tasks, then that learning is not going to generate to other parts of space. Or if you're training certain features, it won't generalize to other features. But if you're training attention or working memory or some domain of information processing that's higher in the hierarchy, then the benefits will generalize to the lower mechanisms that then feed into it. And so these are the kind of ideas that get in play in brain training games, that get in play in perceptual learning, the action video game literature, and whatnot. And as I mentioned earlier also, this isn't just a low-level visual or sensory phenomenon, but in fact, it's more of a interaction between decision mechanisms, which are taking in the input of the sensory systems and making a judgment based upon signal to noise. You have imperfect signal, you have noise, and the decision variable needs to make a decision based upon external and internal noise. Okay, so it gets better. The decision areas get better at listening to the sensory areas, and the sensory areas get better at listening or tuning to the external environment through practice, through learning. We've got two triangles. Here's our circle. And this is just simply this feedback loop where we have the kind of mantra, and this happens, the quantified warrior movement and biosensing and self-monitoring. We all want to know where we are, how many steps we take in a day, how good our abilities are. So we assess them, then we compare them. We see how good are they compared to our peers, and then we do things to make ourselves better. We change our diet, we practice, we do training and whatnot. So this is the sports vision training circuit that's kind of being utilized in a whole bunch of kind of rapidly growing marketplace of products and tools that are aimed at improving these abilities to free up bottlenecks to improve outcome performance. And so I listed a few of them here, and I'm going to mention Spark from Nike, which is actually kind of now defunct and has been moving into its second generation by Synaptech, which is Herb's company. But there's many more. NeuroTracker does the same types, does training with multiple object tracking. Dynavision is a light board, hand-eye coordination. Ultimize is a really a great approach for improving low-level vision based on perceptual learning. And then there's simulations, which probably operate on a whole different realm, but I threw them in there nonetheless. So that's two triangles and a circle to kind of give you guys the sphere of sports vision, what's important in that realm, and how it's being targeted for interventions. Now let's talk a little bit about how this actually unfolds in both practice and in a research context. I called it State of the Science, Limitations, and Future Directions. Some of this stuff we've already touched upon. So athletes, coaches, and trainers all want to know the answers to fundamental questions about sports vision. More importantly, they want to use this knowledge to improve their performance and they'll buy in and they'll do things that they think are advantageous, and they won't buy in or do things that they don't think are advantageous. They're not psychology subject pool subjects who are coming for course credit. They are people who are high performers, usually on a tight regimen, doing the things that they need to do, and research is not one of them. So, but if they think there's an advantage, they will certainly move towards it, and they will certainly try to use it, and you have your targets of opportunity as a scientist there. A lot of the challenge comes with proper controls, because it's very hard to say, okay, you guys get this great approach, and you guys are our control group. By and large, they're not buying into that. If they think it's good, they want everyone to have it, and if they don't think it's good, they don't want it. So they have a vested interest, but also little time. Their kind of expert structure is that experts are experts, and they're doing their expertise. So working with radiologists, we try to build those into grants, and you got to pay them 10 times as much as an undergrad to come in and do a visual search task or something. But there's programmatic areas where traction is being made. So in some spheres of athletic training, people are buying into this more. Optometry, you always have the opportunity to work with people who need the correction, or for the assessment of people who might need the correction. And then concussion management, I've already mentioned. So a real pragmatic issue with concussion management is concussions are all different. The comorbidity of things that go into concussions and come out of concussions is very complex. And it's always really best to have an internal baseline, pre and post concussion, in order to know, how messed up are you relative to how messed up you were before. So concussion management is this is a field where they want to know these answers too. So methodological and statistical problems are pervasive in this realm for science. So one of them that probably gets glossed over a lot, and it's surprising it hasn't really come up yet in our conversation, is how small the sample sizes are. You don't have big packs of experts traveling together for research studies. So let me jump ahead to this meta-analysis slide. I mentioned these guys earlier, and these are the guiding lights for me in terms of the science out there. They've done formal meta-analysis. They selected papers based upon categories and keywords, and then they've vetted them, and then they categorized effects, quantified effect size, did effect size analysis, and over 42 studies, 388 effect sizes of almost 1,300 subjects, they found the athletes had 31% better response accuracy, and they had 35% better reaction times, fewer fixations of longer durations, prolonged quiet eye periods, and visual search tasks. So they are faster, they're more accurate, and they know where to look. The average group size across these, let me just tell you this one. So this was 20 studies, 200 effect sizes, that many subjects, and this is the general. These are the more specific, sport-specific, these are the more general cognitive abilities. They found better performance on processing speed and attentional paradigms, and that athletes from interceptive sports, where you're trying to hit or catch, rather than swimming or static or dynamic. These imperfect boundaries between how you categorize sports, with the notion that different positions within the same sport might have totally different roles. But they found differences in there as well. They also found gender differences. So across these, the average group size is only 19 experts. Okay? 19 experts. Each study uses a slightly different task. I have a Stroop task, you have a flanker task, somebody else has a slightly different cognitive control task. We'll lump them all together, right, in our meta-analysis, because those are all accuracy, or those are all reaction times. So they get clumped together, and also a big problem is, what is your control? Okay, a mere exposure would suggest that, or developmental spans would suggest that you can't compare a professional athlete to someone who's younger. Right? You have developmental trajectories. You have different sports. Is that a fair comparison? Do you really want to have high achievers and low achievers within the same realm? All-stars versus non-all-stars, let's say. So what your comparison is in any of these studies is variable. So even doing a meta-analysis over these types of things makes it really challenging to aggregate. So I'm almost done. I'm running on the end of my 20 minutes, 30 minutes here. But so you have inconsistent classification of experts. You have variable tasks that are hard to aggregate, imperfect control groups. And then what's really important is there's little clear mapping of tests of the task to athletic performance. Is it the case that better visual acuity really results in better batting average? So these types of mapping, where much of the science has not focused on the tip of the pyramid, the on-field performance of the goal, they've mostly focused on differences that are happening lower in the pyramid. And what we want to know is, does it really have any impact on the outcome? Okay, the goal of the sport, the goal of whatever the expert is trying to achieve. So that is what makes this the kind of the questions of vertical integration in the science really challenging, dealing with these small sample sizes and having imperfect matching and all these other complexities in here. So how do we get past this? Now, some of our task here over the next few days is to kind of come up with some ideas, but this term got thrown around a little bit this morning. It gets thrown around all the time, and I bet if we asked everybody in this room what big data is, they would have a different impression. The people who do genetics and genomics, they would look at what I call big data, and they would say, that's a rounding error, right? And I look at it, and I would say, wow, man, we got some killer big data. But having consistency across the different regimes, the different types of experts that you're trying to lump together is certainly advantageous. So having kind of unified measures, having big sample sizes that allow you statistical power to compare and not group, those are really important, in my mind, important virtues of science going forward. So standardized measures collected in large populations of high performers, big data. Where I'm going with all this is I'm going to introduce you to this really killer research program we have going on. And again, you want to establish the links between these tasks, these measures that you're collecting, and on-field performance. You know, if you're talking to the coach who can evaluate expertise and has a great eye for this, you got to be convincing. So having these links, not just improving their core abilities, but improving their actual on-field performance, and again, having your proper controls. So with that, let me introduce you guys to the Spark Sentry Station. And this is not, I didn't develop this. This is kind of an opportunity that I've had to do research with big data tools that are out in the field. So Nike and the Spark branch developed this sensory performance tool, and actually a couple different tools, but I'll mention this, which is the COG in the Assess, Analyze, and Improve circle, which is meant to be kind of a preclinical vision screening tool. So you have athletes who might be working with trainers, who might be going into eye care practitioners, or maybe on a team, and you'd get assessed. It has a high-resolution screen in the back, a touch screen in the front that slides up and down. You respond from distance with an eye touch. It has NVIDIA liquid crystal lenses for depth perception. And it has a battery of 9 sensorimotor tasks, meant to be kind of preclinical. So acuity, contrast sensitivity, depth perception, things that would, if they were poor, you would get routed in through to an optometrist. You say, okay, go get correction, fix some of the hardware problems that you have using optometric techniques, but then you could train those abilities and other abilities that are also measured to improve your performance. So it measures those low-level hardware, but also has accommodation vergence. It has a spatial working memory. It has a go, no-go response inhibition. It has a eye-hand coordination task, simple reaction time. So it has a whole bunch of tasks that all the data gets uploaded to a central database, and you get back your norm, your performance relative to your peer group. So if you say, I'm a high school girls soccer goalie, and you're the worst, you're near the middle. If you're the best, you're near the outside. So this is your percentile rank on the radial plot. And you can compare yourself to everybody else, but you can compare yourself, tracking yourself over time. So it has its strengths, it has its limitations. The strength is certainly the big data, because this is out in the field. It's being used by a lot of groups that are interested in this screening. They're interested in performance from a practical side. They want to be able to route their athletes to vision care practitioners. They want to work with athletic trainers in order to improve these abilities. There's other tools that are involved in the training also. I won't go into those now. It's pretty quick. It takes about 25 minutes to complete. It's engaging. That's hugely important, because these people, they're busy. You want to have a good experience so that they are vested. And it has a lot of demographic information, how many concussions you've had, what sport you play, what your position is, what level and whatnot. So it kind of has a vision sensorimotor profile, and it also has a demographic-y profile. And what's really nice is it's big data. It allows us to we have chunks of over 1,000 professional athletes. We have 1,300 collegiate athletes. So this data set's bigger than those meta-analyses by itself. So it's a wonderful target of opportunity with its warts and shortcomings that are in there. Here's some of the groups that are using it. You go from really high-level professional teams of some research labs, collegiate teams, both Duke and UNC. We get along well, working together on that. Here's a little the sample as of a few weeks ago. It's also some of the systems are offline. They're embedded in military groups that they don't share their data. So there's a few of the tactical, but there's also a bigger sample of tactical special operations soldiers and others who are using it. And we have a user group. We try to get communication amongst the practitioners. So this is really a target opportunity. This isn't something that we developed in our lab and went and used, but it speaks to where you might have an opportunity to get useful data for assessing expertise and whatnot. So we're very excited about it. But what's really important is that vertical integration across the program. So some of the users up in North Dakota, Dmitry Poltoski and David Bieberdorf, they wanted to know, well, does this performance actually predict on-ice performance, right? That's the peak of the pyramid. So they had 40 college hockey players. They assessed them. They performed multiple linear regression and found that 69% of the variance in goals could be predicted by 4 of the software tasks: near-far quickness, response inhibition, perception span, and reaction time. So it's beginning to have that link between measured task abilities and actual on-field performance. Again, it's not a huge sample size, but it's certainly a step in the right direction for the validity of the tool. And in a similar vein, the group over at UNC, they are the ones who developed the head impact telemetry systems they're basically gyroscopes in the helmet that give you linear and rotational acceleration, for measuring concussions. And they found that amongst a bunch of collegiate football players, people who performed high on the Century Station before the season had lower incidences of impact than the people who performed lower. An imperfect study, but certainly a step in the right direction. So there's kind of this validity and measuring outcome variables along. So give me one second, because this is, I think, my last slide. So let's discuss.